Thank you for joining us on today's Shinjiro sessions. As we're continuing to acknowledge, celebrate AAPI month, I want to introduce Dr. Ada Cheng. She's a professor turned storyteller and show producer. Thank you again, Ada. The floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Linda, for having me. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Hi, my name's Ada Cheng, and the way that usually I introduce myself is I'm a professor turned storyteller, solo performer, storytelling show producer. So I was a tenured professor in sociology at DePaul University from 2001 to 2016. When I resigned to pursue performance and storytelling. And so I have that, what I call the second chance in life, a huge jump off the cliff and change and transition. And so I want to share this journey with you. There is a recording which is combined with a visual, really is visual storyteller using photos to tell a story. So I'm going to have Linda share that particular video because I have to speak very fast, right, during the recording. That's not how I usually would share stories, but I want you to listen to the journey. Thank you. Go ahead, Linda.
One moment.
In November 2015, 5 minutes before midnight, before I sent an email to my colleagues to resign from my tenure position, I asked myself one simple question. What was the question? What does that have anything to do with dishes? Come find out. I was a tenured professor in sociology at DePaul University from 2001 to 2016 when I resigned for storytelling, theater, and performance. How did I go from being a professor to a storyteller? Imagine one August morning in 2015, 8:30 in the morning, and I'm sitting on my bed surrounded by my 3 cats, one calico, one gray, and one black. They're looking at me and screaming, feed me, feed me. At that moment, I thought to myself, I think I'll do better as a stand-up comedian. I immediately went online to Second City website, ready to sign up for my very first improv class. Before I registered, I thought of something my mother said to me decades ago. But first, let me tell you something about my Chinese name. My given name in Chinese is Shu Ru. Shu means like a lady. Ru means good luck. My parents wanted me to be like a lady and have good luck. I was a tomboy and a strong feminist. We didn't see eye to eye about my future. When I was 16 or 17 years old, I told my mother I wanted to major in philosophy and political science. This was what my mother said to me. You are going to bring shame to this family if you don't become a doctor. Look at your cousins. They are becoming doctors. Later, when I told her I want to major in theater and performance, she said this to me. No. You are not going to make it. You are just not pretty enough. Imagine, I was simply trying to sign up for an improv comedy class. What was I thinking about? Something my mother said to me decades ago that I was not good enough, not enough. And I thought to myself, wait a minute. I am a grown woman. I'm 50 several years ago. Why do I allow something somebody said to me decades ago to affect my decision to pursue comedy? Besides, there are ugly people doing comedy than I am. So I immediately signed up for my first comedy class, improv class. And I started taking classes in summer 2015. I still remember rolling on the floor in the classroom, chasing my younger classmates, playing different characters. I was feeling passionate. I was feeling alive. But then everything changed when fall came. At night, I would be taking performance, comedy, and storytelling classes. I was living my youthful dream and youthful passion. But when I went back to school during the day, everything felt different. Teaching felt like a job for me when I was in the classroom. And this is what I realized. I was falling in love with theater and performance. I loved my students, but I just wasn't in love with teaching anymore. But then, how do I quit this job? I came to this country 30 years ago in 1991. I'm an immigrant. When I first arrived, I could barely write in English, not to mention finishing thesis, dissertation, or even writing a book. When I got tenured in 2006, I thought I made it in the United States. I had respect, prestige, status, and a middle-class lifestyle. It was very difficult to let go of that successful immigrant narrative. I had everything except one thing, happiness. I wasn't happy. And I would struggle with the decision for a long time. During the day, I would go to class and teach. At night, I would go home and cry. And I would ask myself, do I continue to do this until the age of 65? Until one night, everything changed when my cat, Sarah, came to me wanting to be petted. And I was so miserable, unhappy that I yelled at her, "You go away." This gentle, beautiful cat with green eyes and gray hair. You know what I was thinking about? My father, who passed away 2 years before I left Taiwan, who was so miserable, took it out on his family because he felt oppressed at work. I was turning into someone I didn't like, someone like my father. Whatever the university was paying me, it was not enough. A decision had to make. I had to jump off the cliff. I didn't want to be dead before I died. So I started typing, "Dear colleagues, after 15 years of teaching, it's time for me to leave." Before I hit send, I asked myself one simple question. Am I going to be okay if I have to wait tables and wash dishes? And the answer is yes. At least I would be happy. And I have been since January 2016 when I started telling stories. I took a chance on myself and I gave myself a second chance in life. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Would anybody like to say a few words about if the stories resonate? How do they feel? When they listen to the story, what resonated with them? Yes, Rachel.
Hi. So I'm sorry. I broke down.
Oh, that's okay.
It was beautiful.
Thank you.
Absolutely beautiful. And it hit home. It hit home so deeply. And for you to share is so brave. And I adore it. So thank you so much for sharing your story.
What hit you, Rachel? This is the power of storytelling. What was the part that hit you the most? If you don't mind sharing with us.
Oh, no problem at all. I'm just really sorry if you can't fully understand me because, me crying over it. But I'm first generation here in America. My family came from the Philippines, and my mother had a very similar story in regards to her coming here. she actually paved the path by sacrificing everything she had in the Philippines to come to America to make means. And, you know, she came here in the middle of winter, actually, not being prepared for it all. And I feel your struggle, and I support my mother throughout everything, because I understand the hard life and the struggles with the cultural differences that we're facing. And, you know, with us being here in America, you're torn between staying completely traditional or trying to fully adjust here in the States. And, you know, we're raised with respect being such a high level and number one. So you don't want to disrespect your family. You don't want to be the black sheep of the family at all. You don't want to bring disappointment in any way. And you want to continue making, you know, everyone proud by showing that, you know, with the hard journey of coming here, you don't want to waste it. And you want to show them that you appreciate the struggle that everyone had to go through before us. And I call
Thank
myself
you.
an old soul. So I relate, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, who else resonate? This is great. I want some conversation. I'll do the presentation. Who else would like to share? Because this is really, this whole thing about hanging on to that success image almost killed me, right? That I want to be successful, yet I'm not doing what I want to do. Who else would like to share before I start talking about in terms of what I do? Who else would like to share what resonated with you? Yes, Teresa.
Hi, actually, my parents said the same thing, like, you're going to be a doctor, lawyer, engineer. So in undergrad, I studied biomedical science, and I was like, okay, since I have to be a doctor, I applied to dental school, and I got in. And when I told my parents, hey, mom and dad, I got into dental school, and they're like, why? I thought you want to be a doctor. And then I told them, like, yeah, a dentist is a doctor. And they're like, no, it's a fake doctor. You should apply to medical school. And I was like, oh, I thought you would be happy, and they weren't at all. So right now I'm actually taking a break from dental school, and during this time I'm really going to see if this is something I really wanted to do, or this is something that I thought I wanted to do because that's what my parents wanted me to do.
Very good. Thank you so much, Teresa. Thank you so much. So I want to show you the reason I want to give both of you time to talk about your stories is you can see right now we're building this community right here together. A community will not exist if we don't share stories with one another. And most often time we have stories that we have shared components, we have commonalities, but we also have differences. And so it is important for us to share stories, and something with younger generation. One thing that younger generations struggles the most is this tension between gratitude and the debt to their parents, but also how to pursue one's passion and true authenticity. So I started, and we're going to come back to have conversation again. So I just want to show you that first part, when we are sharing together, this is how I bring the community together. Not just I share stories, but everyone shares stories, right? And that's the power of storytelling. We share, but we also witness one another. I started sharing stories in 2016. In the beginning, let me share a PowerPoint. I'm a trained sociologist, right? So providing sociological analysis is what I do. That's my trade. And so when I started telling stories, what I really want to do is recognizing the injustice and inequities in the world. That's really my starting point, without a doubt. I want to use storytelling for specific purpose, for us to understand the Asian American experiences, for us to understand structural inequities, for us to understand our shared and different experiences under the system of white supremacy. And so those are the questions that I struggle with. How do we use storytelling to critique and address inequity, privileges, and injustice? How do we produce events and shows that benefit marginalized communities? And what does it mean to produce community-centered storytelling shows, events? And I want to share with you why it was important for me to do that. When I first started telling stories in the Chicago scene, I was one of the few Asian American women telling stories. And oftentimes I would tell stories in white-dominated spaces, and I would be the only one telling stories about violence, racism, intimate partner violence, sexual assault. And I really didn't want to do that. I didn't want to be the token. And what I was witnessing at the time in the sort of whiteness of the world is that you oftentimes, white producers have, okay, we check the list and what we call the tokenism. We have the Black teller, and that would be that same Black teller forever. We have a Latinx, then that Latinx teller will be forever. Now I'm the Asian, I can check off many boxes, right? Immigrant, Asian woman, queer woman, and therefore I fit. I can, they can check off many categories. And so I see that kind of a tokenization, and I didn't really want to replicate that pattern. And I also see that the audience members were predominantly white audience, and I really want to tell stories for my own community and for marginalized communities. And so for me, is this question of equity. How do I bring more AAPI folks into the storytelling scene? How do I produce shows for them to tell stories, right? How do I bring events to community spaces? And so that started my producing journey. And so when I produce storytelling shows, I started producing shows in 2017. And there are several principles that I use to produce shows. One is the principle, the most important principle is equity. I ask myself, who is telling stories, right? All of us have stories to tell. We shouldn't simply have community leaders telling stories. Most of the time, there's such inequity and diversity within each community. If we only have very few telling stories, then we are going to replicate the same narrative over and over. And so I create spaces, not just for, and sure, I'm happy to have community leaders, but most importantly, I want to produce shows for community members. That means all of us here in the room, ordinary people, people who are not artists, people who are not performers, people who may not have the opportunity to share stories. And I want to give them space. And so that means I look around, I ask a question, who is telling stories and who is not telling stories? And that question of who is not telling stories is actually far more important. I want to go deep into the community. I want to go beyond community leader. I want to get, for example, ordinary folks. And most often time, the leadership tends to reflect the privileged perspective of a community. So it is very important for us to look at the inequities within the community. I ask the question, who is listening, right? I want to produce shows for community members. What's being told? What kind of stories are being told, right? So think about now we face anti-Asian racism. When we think about victims, survivors, whose stories are we telling? If you think about 50 years later, when they look back to the history of this time, whose stories will be told, right? And so we have to be very careful what stories are being told and how are stories told. That's a very important question as well. And who controls the platforms? And so for me, that's really the most important thing, that I want to create storytelling platform for people to tell stories. And so the critical question that I ask myself, and I will encourage everyone to create platforms for your own members. What's my role in addressing inequity and privileges in the storytelling world? And how do I benefit from tokenism? And I really want to dismantle that. I want to make sure that I uphold, right? Uplift, when I say uplift and amplify underprivileged voices, I mean that. I don't want to benefit from tokenism. And we need to go beyond single narrative representing the whole community. We really need to excavate multiple stories, multiple perspectives, and multiple narratives, right? And how do I cultivate different kinds of audience, right? And beyond celebrating culture, for me, it is very important to examine racial injustice in my own storytelling show. And so the first storytelling show that I created for AAPI community members is Talk Stories, Asian American and Asian Diaspora Storytelling Show. And so the first two shows we hosted at theater space. After that, then I took it to community spaces. So for example, I have worked with Japanese American Service Committee, National Cambodian Heritage Museum, and Chinese American Museum of Chicago to work with them, right? And to bring these shows to the community spaces. And so what I do is also use these events as a way for the community members to gather, and we listen to stories, we witness one another's stories. And there's a reason why I want to bring storytelling shows to community spaces, because I also want people to know what's going on at community centers, to know about each other's histories. What better way to bring people to the space so they get to see what a community center is like and the history, right? So what I would usually do is when I host Talk Stories, I would say, come an hour earlier and go look at the exhibit, right? Understand the history. And when you come to listen to stories, then you will understand, right, how to connect the exhibit, right, with the stories. And with Talk Stories, it's really a story center variety show. I have 5 tellers telling personal stories, and I have improvise, right? Improv groups. They will improvise based on the stories that they heard that night. And then we have music and dance. And all the cast, the whole lineup will be AAPI community members. And so what do I hope to achieve with these shows? The first one is to situate these shows at community spaces. I think oftentimes we have this assumption that people want to host shows at prestigious theaters. Here's the truth is not all community members can afford to buy tickets to go to shows. Not all community members can afford, right, to go to shows, to go to theaters. People sometimes operate, right, at the level of survival. So if we want to talk about access, right, equity in access, meaning how do we make sure that community members can have access? What better way to simply host the shows at community spaces? And the other goal is to make sure that we understand one another's stories, histories. Most often time, the community, even though we use APIDA, AAPI, the whole community is also very fragmented in the sense that we don't always know one another's histories, right? We might know our own history, but we don't know one another's histories. And it is important for us to understand, right, that is the Taiwanese, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, what are our points of convergence? What are our points of differences? And so for me, it is very important for us to understand one another's histories. The other thing is recognizing differences in inequities. And one of the things is that we need to be very careful about treating the whole community as homogenous, right? And there's a danger. So in my shows, I make sure that I also amplify voices from Southeast Asia, South Asian Americans, that we make sure that it's not just East Asian perspectives. We make sure that LGBTQIA community members, I make sure that we address issue, gender inequity, colorism, racism, homophobia, transphobia. I make sure when I, decide, curate the lineup, I make sure that the shows address issues facing all of us in the community. And the show since 2017, I have been taking it to community spaces, and it has been very successful. Since the pandemic, I have been hosting the shows online and making sure that these are spaces, just like what we're doing here, is the place where community members can gather. And one thing very important that I have been doing is to cultivate community members as storytellers. And so I like to include community members, people who are not artists and performers, as storytellers. And I offer storytelling workshops. I work with them on their narratives, and then I prep them for performance to stand in front in public to tell stories. That's what I have done, and with different communities. And in particular, I work very closely with the National Cambodian Heritage Museum. And so I offer storytelling workshops to youth. I offer storytelling workshops to adults. I offer storytelling workshops to anyone, right? And then in addition to AAPI center shows, I also integrate community members to my other shows. I regularly produce a monthly show called Pour One Out, and it is a show predominantly for BIPOC and queer tellers. And then I integrate AAPI community members into other shows as well, because we can't just share stories in our own spaces. We also need to make sure that we share stories in other platforms as well. So I want to make sure that storytelling, right, is something that everybody has access to, that they have a space to tell their stories. I also work with community organizations to help them institutionalize, right, storytelling as their practice, meaning that I work with, for example, National Cambodian Heritage Museum, and I find ways to see where they can institutionalize storytelling and integrate community members. And so they can, it's a way to pass on my own skill set, right? It's my own way of giving back as an artist, right? That I have the privilege of working with community members. So it is always very important for me to make sure that I also pass on the skill set. And so, so it's a form of giving back. And so the concrete strategy that I have been using for these shows is using storytelling to address central issues facing our community. I pay community members. I cultivate community members as storytellers. I also work with community organizations to institutionalize storytelling as a practice. Now, The other show that I produce is called Story Speaking Truth series. It's a very similar principle, except the shows is specifically for BIPOC and queer tellers, meaning I bring people from different racial, ethnic communities together to tell stories based on the same thing, right? And there's a reason why it is important to do that. We can no longer do work in isolation. We have to think about building solidarity with different racial groups. And Speaking Truth series is one way to do that, where I bring storytellers from the Black community, from the Latinx community, from the Middle Eastern, Arab, Muslim community, where we share personal stories, and then we can understand what are our shared experiences and how our experiences are different. And I also want to bring these communities together so they get to see what our AAPI community organizations are doing, so other people understand our history as well. And it's the same principle. I invite tellers from different communities. I cultivate community members from different communities. I want to use these events as a community engagement, right? Opportunities for community building, where everyone come together, witnessing one another. I want to also pass on, right, the skill set to other communities as well, right? And so it's a very similar principle. And so one example, the best example would be National Cambodian Heritage Museum. I have been working with this organization since 2017. In the beginning, I brought my own solo performances to this organization, and then I started producing show there. Now I work with the Cambodian Museum in terms to create programs specifically for their members, youth workshops. And then we're going to do storytelling circles for caretakers, for younger generations, right? Young people like you. And so these are my way of giving back. And this is what I have been doing since 2016, 2017. I want to talk a little bit about what I have gained from this process. Storytelling is not just a show for me. It really is a commitment, right? That I do community work, engage with the community. And the critical question that I ask myself is how do people, right, benefit from these events in a concrete sense? These are the important questions that I ask myself. How do I make sure that the communities benefit from my work, right? How do I give back to the communities through storytelling? And stories are not just ways for us to celebrate diversity. Stories are ways for us to critique, right, structural inequities. And that comes very natural to me as a sociologist. That's what I do, right, using storytelling to raise critical consciousness, to provide a structural critique. And so that's the work that I have been doing since 2017. It has been a very fulfilling process. It has been incredible. I feel very privileged to work with community members. And to be honest, just these past few years, working with people from all walks of life, from older generations to younger generations, and excavate our own history, right? The stories that I have excavated and preserved is unbelievable. And so it just has been an amazing journey for me. So I'm going to stop here in terms of my presentation, and we're going to have some conversation. So let's open up for some conversations. Any questions? Mina, did you want to say something?
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was on mute and my daughter was yelling. I didn't have any questions, but I think everything that you brought up as far as storytelling and just connecting the communities, I think, I do agree that's like how we're able to better understand one another. And I think, people say it a lot, let's just have the conversation, but the conversation isn't like initiated. So I think, what you're with the storytelling is, a great step, closer to better understanding, everybody in the different communities. So thank you for sharing all that, and very like in depth too.
Thank you. And one thing I want you to think about, the difference when I was doing storytelling, in academia. You think about in academic world or even in the corporate world, we oftentimes have this mindset in terms of debate. We oftentimes operate at the level of debate, right? We listen to respond. Most often time we are, have this a defensive posture. We listen to one another in order to respond. And most often time, our mode is I agree or disagree. That was essentially how I was like when I was in academia, where I simply agree, right? We agree or disagree. And here's the thing: when we operate on the level of agree or disagree, then all we want to do, right, is to figure out who is right and wrong. Most often time we operate at the level of you are wrong, I'm right. And so people, you can think about how people engage in conversations in social media, right? But here's the thing, using storytelling is really for us to think about when someone is telling their stories. If you're human, your first response is not I agree or disagree with you. Your first response is, okay, I'm sitting here, I'm listening to you. I thank you for the opportunity to take me on that journey. I'm willing to empathize, sympathize, compassion, and I want to, and hopefully I feel emotionally driven, right, to do something to make the world a better place. And it is a very different kind of mode of dialogue, inquiry. That means our urgency is not to prove who is right and wrong. Our urgency is to empathize, to understand with one another. And then hopefully we are willing to do something to make the world a better place for everyone. And this is particularly important. Most often time, I find in, as a community, and it is very difficult to address issues of inequities, right? And totally understandable from the marginalized point of view. We want to present a cohesive front. Most often time, it is very difficult to address gender inequality. It is very difficult to address colorism. It is very difficult to address homophobia, right? Transphobia. I find within the communities, there are issues that people, would rather not to talk about: intimate partner violence, sexual assault, masculinity, right? We don't want to talk about these issues. So it is very difficult to engage in conversation. So oftentimes I use these platforms for us to confront, right, inequities within our own communities. That difficult issues that are very difficult, people would prefer to be silent, right, about. And so this is something to think about, right? How can we use, right, storytelling to confront issues that are urgent, but we may not feel comfortable addressing head on? Thank you. How about others? Crystal,
Oh,
who-
yeah.
Yes, Rachel, go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't want to like hog up the conversation.
No, go ahead.
But so everything you've mentioned definitely resonates in me, and that's something that, you know, we're all spread out in different areas, so trying to be that voice for others and help them, you know, raise their voice, it is a struggle. So when so I'm kind of seeking advice. When you're trying to empathize with others by sharing your story, because it does teach lessons in it, multiple ones. If the audience is still not getting it and their feedback is more negative than you expected, how do you deal with that? And how do you stay motivated to keep pushing through?
Let me ask you this question. Is being liked important to you?
Well, it's more so on the respect level. You give
Okay.
respect, you know, and usually get it. So not everyone respects the story or what you're trying to send out.
So this is regardless whether the audience is white audience or audience is our own. And this is kind of what I learned, and it is also very gendered. Okay, is when I was younger, you know, and I grew up in a family. It's you know is you know misogynist in that, right? Gender inequality, where you are a woman, you should be polite, respectful, right? Your brother is more important, and your brother would become the man in the house if your father, right? All these. And so when I was younger, I did a lot of silencing, right? Because there was such a pressure where you don't want to challenge. Even when you speak truth, you got to be appear to be very polite and respectful, right? And there's such a struggle of being liked and being respected, right? And I think at some point, I will tell you one example. At some point, the cost when I first started teaching in 2000, the incident took place in 2002. And that was I started teaching right in 2002. And I was completely shocked by how students were, what's the word? Unruly, right, in class. I grew up in a culture where students bow to their teacher. And so my students at the time, predominantly white, would, reading for newspapers, serving the net, or reading for other classes, or they would get up in the middle to use the restroom, and they would slam the door. I mean, there were behavioral issues that I feel very embarrassed to confront them. And so at some point, I finally had to confront them, because as the weeks went on, I started to have this rage inside me. I was angry with my student, but fundamentally, I was angry with myself for allowing them to disrespect me. So you need to understand, when you do not know how to, or cannot draw boundaries with people, that rage is not going to be about other people. You're going to have rage towards yourself. And this is what I asked him. I said, what do you behave? I directed, what do you behave in the same way in your other classes? Do you, if not, what makes you feel comfortable behaving this way? So I asked my student. So one student said, well, that's because you're short. I said, right on, you're right. In our society, we don't have much respect for short people of short stature. Keep going. Another student said, I think people don't see you as an authority figure because you're a woman. Absolutely. In our society, we don't have much respect for women. I said, what else is going on here? No one said a word. So I said, How about my being Asian? You think I'm a pushover. You think you can do whatever you want and you can get away with it. And so there's silence. It took that experience for me to realize I can no longer do the silencing myself. I cannot silence my truth. I cannot silence my voice. I cannot allow people to push me over. And so if that choice is between speaking up and not being liked and ostracized, I would choose speaking up, right? When I was younger, I asked a question, what's the price to pay when you speak up? Now the question I ask people to ask themselves, what's the price to pay when you don't? Because you're going to do harm to yourself. So I want to encourage everybody, truth is yours. Speak it. And if you don't know how to advocate, you got to know how to advocate for yourself. And if you don't know how to advocate for yourself, you will not know how to advocate for other people. And this is what the power of storytelling is about. The more you tell stories, bravery is a practice. The more you are brave, the braver you become. So practice speaking up. Thank you. Crystal.
Oh, I was going to ask, about when you said about how we're mostly silent about issues of transphobia, gender inequality, and domestic violence, and I think that's amplified with our cultural tendencies of being Asian American. So you mentioned that you've created like platforms to dismantle this type of thing, but I was wondering because Asian Americans, I don't think a lot of the community tends to like go to platforms like that or tends to go out to events that will speak about that type of thing. So how would we start conversations within our own families when they're not seeing the same things that we see and they don't tend to go out to the same things as us?
Really tough question because I struggle with it. You can look at now the conversation about violence against Asian women. And violence against Asian women existed prior to 2020, 2019. But no one was paying attention. No one wanted to speak about it. Before 2019, I approached some community organizations to do workshop on gender-based violence. No one wanted to do it. And this is from the same organizations now are talking about we need to center Asian women's experiences. We need to address violence against women. I have seen a lot of community AAPI male activists, advocates address, reinterpret crimes on gender-based violence, but only cross-racial context. But we don't want to address intra-racial, intra-community violence. I integrate these issues in Talk Stories, in Speaking Truth series. I also produce a show called Am I Man Enough? And this is a show about stories on toxic masculinity. Stories on toxic masculinity. So I also bring, BIPOC people, queer people to examine how toxic masculinity affects, right, everyone, and to address the gender-based violence. It is something that I struggle with a lot. I raise these issues on my shows, in my own talk, but I hit walls, and I hit walls. It's not just with men, with women too, where people don't necessarily want to address harm done to one another within our own community. And so for me is how do we, right? How can we be honest and transparent with one another? How do we hold one another accountable? Crystal, thank you for raising that issue because I want to use storytelling to address that. Because on my shows, Asian women talk about intimate partner violence, sexual assault, child sexual abuse. They really do. And they oftentimes have to make a decision, right, to speak about it. That oftentimes means that they have to make some resolution about their relationship with their own family members. But that's the most empowering thing for them too, is once you speak out, you can't take it back. You have to own the truth. You can't solve problem unless you name it. You can't solve anything unless you name it. And so once you speak the truth, particularly in front of a group of people, you can't take it back. And that's a very different kind of commitment. And so this is what I want to do, with storytelling, is really to encourage younger generations or any generation to be honest with our community issues and to be transparent with one another and to create a better community for everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Who else?
I have one.
Yes, go ahead.
So, because I did meet you at a discussion panel at UIC, and I've gone to a few other ones outside of the school, and I've noticed with like storytelling and people sharing their experiences, I've seen more tension among at least other races when they start comparing like trauma. So how do you navigate still being able to speak on your experiences and like validating that while also acknowledging and addressing other people?
Excellent question. And so these past few years, as I talk to Asian Americans, what's the issue that we struggle with? There's always this, the oppression Olympics. Our situations are not as bad, right? And therefore, and this is what I want to say, you can, right, center your oppression without erasing other people's experiences. You can talk about, so a lot of times, Asian Americans, not all, would be reluctant to talk about oppression because of the privileges. And what I oftentimes say is, your privileges do not erase your oppression at all. Your privileges simply change the shape and the contour of your oppression. So the fact that you have privileges doesn't mean that your privileges make the oppression disappear. So what you want to do is to find a way where you can balance talking about oppression and privileges at the same time. And I never have problem speaking about my own oppression while acknowledging my own privileges. They don't cancel out one another. And that's important to remember. The other thing, storytelling is always about centering oneself. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. However, in my storytelling, I oftentimes do comparison, because the truth is the images and the stereotypes and assumptions about Asian women are also constructed in relation and in comparison to those for women of other racial groups, right? And so you of course you're going to do comparison. And so what you want to think about, you can center your own perspective without erasing others, right? And I want to say this because this question has come up again. Your oppression is oppression. You define it. Other people's oppression is their oppression, right? You don't need to feel just because it's not as severe, as serious. We don't want to fall into the trap of oppression Olympics. And that's something I want to remind people. Does that address your question, Linda?
Yes, that was great. Thank you so much. Did anyone else have any other questions before we wrap?
What are some of your upcoming events?
Pour One Out is a monthly storytelling show. In June 8th, Wednesday, we host the show second Wednesday of the month. This time, next month, we're going to at Semicolon bookstore. I don't believe you're based in Chicago, right? If not, it's in Chicago.
I'm in
Semicolon.
Chicago.
Oh, perfect. Come to Semicolon bookstore. And I plan to host and produce a talk stories. I want to get out of it because there's so many events in May, so I want to wait until later this year. So I'll definitely send Linda the information. But feel free to contact me. You can follow me on Instagram, or you can connect me through Facebook, and I would love to have members here to tell stories as well. And if you're interested, I'm happy to work with all of you and to produce a storytelling event as well, if that's what you're interested. Thank you. Courtney? Yes, semicolon. Courtney, did you raise your hand?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed listening to your story, and you're doing wonderful work.
Thank you so much. And all of you are doing wonderful work too, right? We are all in this together. And I want to encourage everybody to share stories. All of you have tremendous stories to tell. And I want you to think about, right, your family story, your individual stories, and really contact me if you're interested and ready to embark on this journey.